Good afternoon, everybody. This is Brian Keenan, Executive Director of the Bayshore Center at Bivalve, with another interviews from the Meerwald, where we at the Bayshore Center get to talk with some really exciting people in the field of science and history, math, maritime industry. And today we have one of our neighbors here in Bivalve. And we have about 4 neighbors in all of Bivalve. We have Jenny Shinn, who's program coordinator with Haskin Shellfish Research Laboratories, which is part of Rutgers University. And she's in charge of education for K through adults, Jenny?
Yes.
And she focuses her work on the Delaware Bay and estuaries. And for those of you who don't want to know what an estuary is, it's the rivers and bays and waterways that lead into the Delaware Bay. And she is a local South Jersey native, which she prominently posted in her bio. And so Jenny and I, while we're neighbors, we never get to see each other down in Bivalve because she's working so hard in the laboratories. And for those of you who don't know where Bivalve, New Jersey is, I encourage you to look at a map and come down and visit the two of us and maybe take a sail on the Meerwald and stop by Haskins Lab. So Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, happy to do that, Brian. Thanks for having me.
So Jenny, first of all, most people don't know Bivalve exists, let alone that we have a vibrant oyster industry. And
right.
Then add on top of that, that not only is there a Haskins Lab, but there are 3 all along the Delaware Bay. So can you give us a little intro into what is Haskin Labs?
Sure. Rutgers has a long-standing history with oysters in New Jersey. The first oyster lab actually started in the late 1800s, so it's hard to imagine people were concerned about oyster research back at that point in time. But the first laboratory was in the Barnegat area, a very small little building, and then it's expanded to lots of different research fields today. But here in southern New Jersey, the Haskin Shellfish Research Laboratory has several facilities under its umbrella. We have our Bivalve Laboratory, which is right next to the Bayshore Center. There's also an Aquaculture Innovation Center, which is a large-scale hatchery aquaculture facility right on the Cape May Canal. There's also a Cape Shore Laboratory, which is along the Delaware Bay shore in Green Creek, New Jersey. And that's a smaller spawning facility that mainly focuses on rearing oysters or other shellfish too. And then there's an administration building in Cape May right on the harbor. So under, there's 4 faculty members through the facilities and other research associates and technicians all the way down, to interns just in the summer, hourly technicians throughout the year, salaried positions as well. So lots of different capacities within those facilities, mainly focusing on sustainable shellfish and finfish aquaculture and fisheries, not just within New Jersey, but our researchers conduct work throughout the East Coast and beyond, actually, some global work.
A lot of words there that
sorry.
Maybe I don't understand as well, but what I was interested in learning was, one, that New Jersey is still significant in the oyster production, oyster harvesting industry, that we're in the top 3, 4 of oyster producers nationwide. And I think as a New Jerseyan, I was surprised to hear that. But I was also surprised to learn, and you mentioned it, that the state and Haskins or the industry has been concerned about oysters since the late 1800s. And the work that you're doing is well known within the shellfish industry nationally as something called sustainable fisheries. Tell us what that means.
Sustainable fisheries means to have the fishery last and persist throughout time and be healthy. So it's one of the pieces of work that we do at the Haskin Lab is to help with the oyster stock assessment, which is to aid in making sure the oyster resource stays sustainable and is not overfished and is healthy. So we monitor disease, the fishing effort, and different parameters with the fishermen and state agency folks and other researchers to collaboratively make sure that the resource is in good shape.
And is that common in other fisheries? I mean, it probably is common now, I don't know, but I'm suspecting or you guys led the charge on that.
Yeah, from what I understand, the Delaware Bay Oyster fishery is one of the most well-managed and sustainable fisheries in the area, maybe even, looking beyond that in the country perhaps, and it's been monitored for a long time. So as you said, now it's commonplace for many animals that are harvested to have sustainable practices, but not always so.
And what's your role at the laboratories?
As a program coordinator, I lead our education programs, which tries to bring the oyster industry, biology, ecology, and the Delaware Bay, a little bit of Delaware Bay history into local schools. And then beyond that, I assist with disease monitoring of shellfish and other research projects that go on at the Haskin Lab. So I'm very fortunate in that I get to do a little bit of everything, which is a lot of fun.
And these days it's hard for us certainly to get kids down to the Bayshore Center. It must be just as hard for you guys to get into the schools. And I know we often have lofty ambitions about how we're all going to work together to get kids turned on to the industry. But tell us a little bit, about yourself in the field of science. It's still, I think, a man's world. Has that changed? Is it pretty common? I think, I know some of your female colleagues, but is it still a man's world?
I don't know. I think depending on what sector of science you're in, it could be. I know at our facilities, I haven't done the tally, but I would say there are more females employed than males. However, if you look at leadership and directorship type roles, they're mostly male dominated. And going to scientific conferences and things, I've been to local, state, and national meetings. I would say the females are pushing through for marine science, but again, looking at those higher level roles, I think is where there's a little bit of more unevenness. But I mean, when you look at more engineering and those types of fields, maybe chemistry, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think there is some disconnect in other fields of science. But marine science, I think, is doing pretty well as far as inclusiveness.
That's great to hear. It doesn't surprise me that you would be interested in marine biology and marine science, considering New Jersey is a peninsula. A lot of people don't know that, but we are surrounded by water on 3 sides. And that Cape May is the second largest fishery on the East Coast, second only to New Bedford. But a lot of people in New Jersey, don't know that. When you were a little kid, what got you interested in all this?
Just spent a lot of time outside. My parents met fishing, actually, grew up fishing together. And we went out a lot as kids, always on the boat, at the beach, on the water, outside. And so I think it just kind of stuck with me. And I wanted to either be a teacher or I liked marine science when I was deciding to go to college, and I was debating between the two. And someone suggested, go for what you love to do, and there's always someone to teach after. So that's why I went for the marine science. And lo and behold, it works out that I get to do a little bit of both. And yes,
in this time when our education system is so obsessed with impacts and outcomes and test scores and the ability for kids to take field trips or get outside at all. So, it necessarily wasn't something you learned in the classroom, but from real life experience is supported obviously by classroom education and science that got you interested in this specific field. And so, maybe we just see a kid, playing around in the mud and sand of some estuary, but really they're, a future scientist and are making. A good friend of mine growing up has a similar background to you. And we spent all our time as kids on the North Shore of Long Island, seining and fishing and, looking at barnacles and mussels and, just understanding the water life around us. The Delaware Bay is interesting. Bivalve is interesting. For those of you who don't know Bivalve, it was a sort of work town, a company town back in the early part of the last century, where everything was focused around the oyster industry and oyster harvesting. And it was what they say, a vibrant community. There were churches and banks, and there was a movie theater and shucking houses and sailmakers and a post office. All that is gone today for the most part. And somebody recently told me that it was a phenomenon and we shouldn't chase phenomena, that was an unsustainable way for a community to make a living, and that we see the repercussions of that today in Bivalve. Tell us what happened in the 1900s that changed everything from Bivalve. I think I read that they were harvesting 6 million bushels of oysters a year, which sounds inaccurate, too crazy high, to today where it's 240,000 bushels of oyster. What changed in the bay?
Cool. There's a lot of information there packed into that question. So I would say we still have an active and vibrant fishery today, though, for people to keep in mind. It's not like a complete ghost town, just not maybe as it once was, as you described. But there were quite a few factors that came together to cause those changes. Overfishing was obviously one of those factors. The others were disease. There were 2 parasites that came into the Delaware Bay throughout that period in time, and that caused a lot of death in the oyster population, and therefore there were crashes in the industry. So a few factors there. There may be others that I'm missing at this time, but a few things came together, and it really, from my understanding, wasn't sustainable to be fishing at the level that they were fishing at that time.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is so important for us to understand that, while on the surface, Bivalve and Port Norris looked like this economically thriving community, it was all a facade, sort of like Detroit was in the 50s with the auto industry. It was all based around one industry that was overtaking, overfishing, over harvesting, and when it crashed, because it eventually had to, it was not sustainable. It took the fortunes of people and the community around them. And the community we have today in Bivalve and Port Norris is more realistic and thriving with just a smaller population and a healthier balance between people and the sciences and the oyster industry, which I think really speaks to your work, right? Because if it wasn't for the work of Haskins and men and women like you, who were helping us to monitor the fishery, to monitor the oyster stock, and teach us about sustainable fishing, we wouldn't have the thriving oyster stock we have today. And again, who knew? I mean, I'm sure you did, I didn't, that we were number 2 or 3 nationally in oyster production.
Yeah, it's very collaborative, the management efforts today. So it's also attributed to the industry, the fishermen. They really realize the value of restoration, monitoring, and sustainable harvest, in addition to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and state agencies working together with academia, us at Rutgers, and other researchers to make that a great partnership and manage the fishery. It's kind of a unique model, not always that collaborative in other fisheries.
I mean, not just fisheries, most other industries.
Yeah.
Businesses don't want to hear what scientists have to say because it's going to affect their income and revenue production. Maybe the academics don't take the workers so as seriously as they might. But sort of the beautiful thing about Rutgers and Haskins is that is this combination of men and women who are out on the boats every day, who know the bay better than anyone, working with the academics, working with the state sincerely collaboratively.
Right. It totally is. And that's one of the reasons the Bivalve lab was built where it was. So we could be in place in the industry where it's needed the most. So if there is a question or a concern, the industry members can find us easily. We're accessible. They, well, pre-COVID would just come on in with, hey, I found this, or I have this question, or I'm noticing this trend. Do you know anything about that, or can we look at that in the future? Can we add that into a research project? So it's really, really nice to be in the right spot
And
for
you guys are like literally footsteps away from a oyster company, right? Like you share a parking lot.
Yes, we do.
And a lot of times that would be combative. So what do you actually do in Bivalve? What happens there? What's so important about the work there?
So there's a few faculty members that adjunct teach on campus, firstly, and so they have remote classes. We have students, college students, visit the laboratory for a winter class on aquaculture. So that's one purpose of the facility. It's a place for researchers to meet and collaborate. We process samples for shellfish diseases. We also collect and process samples for the New Jersey Stock Assessment Survey, where we look at the oyster stock annually to help set quotas and things, as I mentioned in that collaborative process. We do marsh restoration projects, community education and outreach. There's a large genetics lab there. So we have a researcher that primarily focuses on shellfish genetics, world renowned, actually. So that's really, really neat to have that.
Tell us about the marsh restoration. So again, I'm from New York. We don't, I think, have the appreciation for the marshes and the environment that maybe we should. When I work down in beautiful South Jersey, I stay in Fortescue, which is surrounded by marshes, which have been particularly stinky the last couple of days. But why are those marshes so important, and why are you looking to restore them when historically, at least, over the last 50 years, from a real estate development standpoint, it was bulldoze, infill, develop housing?
Right. Marshes are really important for several reasons. First, they provide habitat for a lot of species, like kind of the nursery ground where many things grow up and develop. They also help bolster the shorelines. So marshes are kind of the first line of defense against storms and rising water levels for a lot of these areas where we're surrounded by marsh. So part of the problem with erosion is it leaves towns a little more vulnerable. So some of the work that we're looking at are using these living shoreline tactics, which consider using greener techniques such as planting marsh grasses or coconut fiber, or using shellfish to make them more of a living edge to help the shoreline keep pace with these changes, as opposed to something like a bulkhead, which is more static, not really living and able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. So we're employing some of these new tactics to try and research how they work and how they persist over time.
It's interesting, in Fortescue, I just noticed the other day that on parts of the island where there are bulkheads, man-made wooden structures, or concrete, the erosion seems to be significantly more evident than in the areas where there is no man-made bulkhead, and there just seems to be marshy grass or bushes and shrubs. There's far more beach than in those man-made areas.
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on right now to investigate the differences between these shoreline tactics to help erosion. But in general, we like to see some greener techniques used when possible, which allows for longevity. But in some instances, they're not really applicable if it's a large scale area. So, sometimes those bulkheads and seawalls are needed, but there's some new technology developing right now with materials that might be a little more suited to shellfish development.
Over the last few years, the quotas have increased for oyster production, oyster harvesting in New Jersey. I understand from our neighbors, Atlantic Cape Fisheries and Cape May Salt and Bivalve Packing, that the demand for oysters continues to outstrip the supply. What are some of what do you think the future is for the industry? Are we, doing pretty well? We're stable, getting the recognition we deserve, or, are we still really, is it tenuous?
So I think one important distinction to make first is there's an aquaculture industry that harvests oysters, and then there's the wild fishery that also harvests oysters. So when I was talking about that collaborative effort to make sure the stock is sustainable, I'm referring to the wild oysters that live out in the Delaware Bay. The aquaculture industry is also a very green and sustainable fishery, but they're planted oysters. They tend them basically farming, but in the water. So two separate entities, just to clarify. So from my understanding, it seems like the oyster stock is in fairly good condition, and disease is still an issue in the bay today, and that's monitored closely. So as temperature, salinities change throughout time, we'll continue to monitor that. But I think right now we're in a pretty good space, and sounds like the state is supportive of increasing aquaculture operations. So that will allow that sector to grow as well to meet the demand for shellfish.
Well, we are certainly lucky that, what luck that you were born and raised right here in South Jersey, and your passion is South Jersey, and taking care of the local environment.
Lucky to be here.
Can people visit the laboratories? How can we tell people to learn more and to support your work?
Well, easily, we do have a website,
which is
hsrl.rutgers.edu, but I can
hsl.edu.
Let me confirm that because, okay, yep, hsrl.rutgers.edu.
Great. And you guys give classes, is it open to the public, tours, that kind of thing?
We do some of that. Well, we did pre-COVID. And so they can, if someone's interested, they can shoot me an email, Jenny, Jenny, Shinn, Shinn, @rutgers.edu. You can't just kind of stroll in. It is open to the public, but we don't really have someone available to give tours, every day at the ready. So appointment only, we can try to accommodate some requests. We do offer programming for, Girl Scout, Boy Scout troops, field trips, those kinds of things as well. And we also have a couple scholarship funds that can be attributed to if people are interested, that help students, support students' work in the summer, as summer internships. Yeah.
And you have been generous with your time and coming over to the Bayshore Center and teaching to a lot of the field trip kids who come our way. We want to thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Happy to be involved.
I have to say that shell bagging is probably the single favorite activity of all children who come to the Bayshore Center. So I want to give a shout out to that and to Project Quartz, which I know is operated out of Haskins Lab. Just give us a 2-second tour on why shell bagging is useful and important and what it is.
Okay, Project Quartz is promoting oyster restoration through schools. It's a program developed at the Haskin Lab, where we work with local school children to teach them about oysters. And the hands-on piece to that project is that they build shell bags, which are basically little oyster restoration units. So the bags are filled with recycled shell, sometimes oyster, clam, or whelk. And oysters, in order to complete their life cycle, need to attach to a hard surface. So the shell bags are used as settlement surfaces for the next generation of baby oysters. So the shell bags can be placed out into the bay, sometimes along the restoration projects. I was talking about the living shoreline projects along the marsh edge. And the new oysters and ribbed mussels will attach to those bags, and they help provide new habitat for oysters and other shellfish.
And it's crazy fun.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Very fun. Lots of hard work.
Lots of hard work.
I think kids
good exercise.
Love to work hard.
Yeah, so, and we have all this information on the laboratories and your contact information in the post connected to this Facebook video. Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I know you're a busy employee, mom of two, one of those amazing women who could seem to do everything and do it well. So I appreciate you taking the time for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Brian, for having me. Really appreciate it.
And a big shout out to Haskins Laboratories. Really encourage people to take a look at their website and to learn more about the work they do. It really is a great connection to New Jersey, not just on the science side, but on the history side as well, and something that we here in New Jersey can be proud of. So we have the information for Haskins Lab above, and hope you will check them out. And we hope that you will join us for our next interviews from the Meerwalds. Take care, Jenny. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Take care.